Good evening, good evening, good evening, everybody. It's so good to see you. Welcome to, let's see what time it is. It's a little bit of the pre read. We've only got a few minutes here, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. Just want to go ahead and warm up the mic, make sure the camera and the lighting and everything like that is okay. So good to see you all here. I see that we've got Angel Monique here in the building. I see that Judy Lee is here. Hello, Judy. Hello, Angel. I see Kamisha Umstead has joined us. Hi, Kamisha. Good to see you. Wonderful to have all of you all here. I am really excited about tonight's read. I'm excited in part because this is a new author, not new to the world, but new to me, and quite possibly new to some of you. Tonight, we're going to be reading the titular story from the collection Miss Muriel and Other Stories by Ann Petry. Now, I have to admit, I was completely unfamiliar with this writer, and having done a little bit of pre-search prior to the show, I'm really excited. um really excited to read this. Now, you guys know that I don't read the stories prior to the performance here. It's always a cold read, but I do skim them. I do kind of go through them. So tonight's read is a little bit long, and so we're going to split it. The overall story is just around 60 pages. Usually the stories that I read here are around about 30 pages. So that kind of gives you an idea. We're probably going to cut it right down the middle. But I'm excited about this writer because she comes from a time and a tradition not dissimilar from Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and yet she eschewed the spotlight in her time. She wasn't so seamy as those two and some of the other writers of the Harlem Renaissance period were. Um, Ann Petry grew up, she was definitely of a New England background, and she grew up somewhat middle class. Didn't start off middle class, but her mother owned a business. Her father was doing pretty well. And they didn't live in a big city. And so she did not experience a lot of the black life that a lot of folk did who lived in more urban towns. And because they were very the household was very sort of, I don't want to say puritanical, but strict, thrifty, efficient. They were very ambitious. They were very driven. They were very the, the children of that family looked towards success. She did not experience the kind of racism that was prevalent in the inner cities around that time, though they were definitely part of the minority in their community. But as is, the pernicious way of racism, it eventually came a knocking, and she experienced some humiliation in school from students, from teachers. One teacher forced her to read the part of an illiterate slave in an Edgar Allan Poe production, making the point to single her out. But her father was an activist, and so when things would happen that would have his daughter set on the wrong path, he would write those letters. He would get the community involved. He was very civic about his business. And so the daughter grew and aspired. And at one point in high school, because she had become such a prolific and proficient writer, the English teacher, the high school English teacher, would read her papers aloud to the class. And at one point commented, "You could be a writer. You could be a writer if you wanted to. You could be a writer if you wanted to." And those were the words that encouraged her and set her on the path of writing. And so she wrote children's stories, and she was a journalist, and she wrote columns and articles, and eventually short stories, and then novels. And so we are going to explore some of her work through this collection, Miss Muriel and Other Stories. And we're also going to read the introduction written by Ms. Jamila Lemieux, who has some interesting and I think strong words to say about why why this author is not as celebrated as so many. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to read that introduction, and we're going to read the first half of this story. Now, um, I made a post earlier today where I talked about this notion of you could be a writer if you wanted to, and similar words were said to me by my high school English teacher, Patricia Seitz. She never let an opportunity pass to tell me how good my writing was, to encourage me to continue writing, to give me opportunities. It was because of her that I ended up going being a part of the National Foundation for Advancement of the Arts. I was a national finalist. I got level 2. I got shafted. I should have gotten level 1, but I got level 2. But I was reading on a national stage. I got to meet and work with Quincy Troop, who became a mentor of sorts for me around that time, and it was a life-changing event to be in a collective of artists just doing our thing. And of course, all the Black artists across disciplines, we found each other and we vibed off each other. And so that led to me being a Governor Scholar, the Governor School for the Arts, and writing there. And I just kind of kept writing. I didn't always drive it, but I did keep writing. Now, the only thing about what Miss Petry's teacher said to her that I would take issue with is, and this is what I'm saying to you right now, shouldn't have been you could be a writer if you want to be. You are a writer if you want to be. You are a writer if you want to be. You, right now, under the sound of my voice, somebody who's listening to this, doesn't think, you don't think you're a writer, but you are. You have a story to tell. You have words, you have voice, you have rhythm, you have passion. And there's something that you can bring into the world that nobody else can. Now, pure talent alone ain't gonna do it. I am a testimony to that. I'm talented as fuck. I'm a hell of a writer. Ain't nobody out there doing it like I do. There's a lot of people doing their thing. Ain't nobody out there doing it like I do. I'm a hell of a writer, but it also takes discipline. It also takes courage. You have to submit. You have to be ready to take the rejection. I don't always want to do that. It takes the fortitude to say, I'm going to write today, even if I don't feel like it, even if I waste this hour, because this paragraph that I churned out in an entire hour, took me an hour to churn out this paragraph, and I don't even get to use it in the final piece, but you do it anyway because the exercise builds up that mental muscle memory that makes you better at your craft. You are a writer. If you choose to be, you are. Not you could be. You are if you choose to be. And if you choose to be a writer, then that means that you act like a writer. You do what writers do. You write. That's what you do because you're a writer. It means you wake up every morning and you choose to be a writer. You are a writer if you choose to be. I want to encourage you tonight to be the writer that you are, to wake up in the morning and choose it. Choose it for 15 minutes before you go to bed tonight. Choose it. You are a writer if you choose to be. You are everything that you choose to be. Period. End of paragraph. We are going to get started shortly, so I'm going to go ahead and put the break in. Give us about 5 minutes. I know we're running a little bit behind time because I stretched this out a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and start the 5-minute clock, and we'll start story time when we come back on the flip. Love y'all. Talk to you soon. Peace.
Yonder music.
All right, it looks like we've got a total screen freeze, and that happens sometimes. I don't know what's going on. I know that the platform that we use to stream has been, they've merged with another company. So we're kind of like T-Mobile and Sprint right now, where everything is kind of, the networks are, they figuring it out. So from time to time, if we get that freeze, just hang in there with us. Listen, I'm so glad to have you all here. Let's go back and just kind of do a roll call. Let's see, we got Judy Lee is here. Angel Monique, thank you so much for calling Ashanti. Make sure that she swings through. Hope to see her. Kelly Ruff, good to see you. Judy Lee says, I hope y'all are feeling well and whole and happy and looking forward to the future as I am tonight. Yes, indeed. Listen, it might be the same shit, but it's a new toilet. And I'm hoping that this one is a lot cleaner than the last one. You feel me what I'm saying? I am looking forward to, at the very least, competence. I'm not going to expect great changes, but I am looking forward to some competence, and I'm looking forward to uh, some of the predictability. Let's put it like that. I see that we got L Jack in the building. What's happening, L Jack? I see Mimi Brown is here. K&M is here. Lisa Bobbitt is here. Happy Thursday, Lisa. Good to see you. Let's see. I don't know why our official tag is doing that, but there it is. Anyway. All right. So it looks like we're all caught up now, and that's cool. So, for those of you all who were here for the brief sort of run through of the pre-read, we are happy and excited tonight to introduce to some, to present to others, the work of Ms. Ann Petry in this collection, Miss Muriel and Other Stories. Now, in one of our posts on social media, and if you're not following us on social media, take a minute right now and go ahead and do that. Obviously, you found us probably on Facebook or YouTube if that's where you're watching us, but make sure that you follow us on Twitter, all right? It's at Storytime Julian. You can see it scrolling there with some of our other information. Make sure that you follow us on Twitter. Make sure that you follow us on YouTube as well, because we do have some upcoming releases. I've been putting them together slowly but surely in the background. I want you to be able to see some of the stuff that's going to be YouTube exclusive. And again, if you ever miss the live, it'll be here on Facebook for a week, but after that, it's always going to be archived on YouTube. So make sure that you go to the YouTube channel and get hooked up there so that you never have to miss it. If you can't, sometimes this is good to have playing in the background while you're at work, while you're kind of zoning, and you're not always going to be able to find it on Facebook, but you will find it on YouTube. All right. So we're going to be reading half of the titular story from this collection, Miss Muriel and Other Stories. We're reading half because it's a little bit of a long story, but I'm excited about it because, you guys know that we do cold reads here. So I never actually read the story until I read it to you. I'm discovering the work or encountering the work for the first time, just like some of you are encountering it for the first time. So, but what I do is I skim through just to kind of see, what kind of topics, if any words jump out, if I see anything that might be problematic. So I kind of have a sense of what I'm dealing with. And just in the skim through, I saw such richness of language and character. I have no idea what her overall style is like, but I am enthusiastic to find out. Before we begin the actual story, though, I want to get into the foreword, which you guys, as you can see by the cover, was written by Ms. Jamila Lemieux. Now, as a scholar, as a researcher, as a journalist, Ms. Lemieux has a very strong point of view about. Oh, hold on, wait a minute, y'all see that? Look at this right here. That little tab. What is that? That is this thing. I got a little, I don't know, just a little story time with Julian holographic sticker swag. This, along with a couple of other items, a couple of other story time items, are going to be in the swag pouch. For those of you all whose names I called out and I said, hey, make sure that you give me your address, you're going to get some story time with Julian stuff because I've been kind of working on putting that in the background. But anyway, Miss Jamila Lemieux has some stuff to say, and this is going to be a really quick forward, and then we're going to go into the story. And then, with whatever time we have left, we're just going to discuss a little bit. As always, I want to encourage you, put your comments out there, put your thoughts out there. Also, let me know that you're here. I see that Terry Meredith swung through. I see that we've got Darina Turner. I haven't seen you in a while, so I'm really glad to see you, Darina. I see Angela Lee Rains is here. It encourages me to know that you're here. So give me a shout out. Let me know you're here. Post your thoughts and your comments, even as we read. As I read the lines, if there's a line that jumps out at you or a thought that you want to come back to, put it there, because then when I see it, I can come back to it too. I'm excited to hear what you all think about it. Like, this is not just, this is a conversation. Okay. But anyway, I'm kind of getting away from the point, and you can probably hear the excitement in my voice tonight. So I just want to go ahead and get started with the forward to Miss Muriel and Other Stories. This forward is written by Jamila Lemieux. There is a pervasive mythology, or perhaps oversimplification is the appropriate term, of Black life in the United States, in which the South, understood to be the epicenter of American racism, is molasses slow in ideology, movement, and progress. On the other hand, the North, particularly its cities such as New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., represents upward mobility, progress, and freedom from the bondage that created African Americans. Of course, the history of both North and South is far more nuanced than that, and the current Black Lives Matter movement, which evolved following high profile police killings in Ferguson, Missouri, Staten Island, New York, and Baltimore, Maryland, provides contemporary evidence counter to this line of thinking. Miss Muriel and Other Stories is a painstakingly complex look at African American life since the 1940s. Instead of relying on well versed tropes about the backwardness of our country cousins and slick city dwellers, Ann Petry creates a loosely interwoven world of Black folks striving to make the best of often devastating circumstances. Petry shows no contempt or preference on the basis of class. She gazes upon her people with a reverence and respect that may leave some readers surprised to learn that the author was born into a successful family in a largely white Connecticut suburb. Petry's loving portrayal of her subjects doesn't mean that Miss Muriel is a cheery read. Her clear-eyed inspection of Black pain finds some of the book's tales ending with a gut-punching plot twist or a resolution that reminds us that optimism about racial justice is as hard to summon now as it was when she first began this volume. The Witness is particularly brutal, detailing the choking nature of the good old-fashioned Northern racism that finds an elderly school teacher unable to protect a young white girl and himself from a diabolical group of white teen boys. The Harlem uprising that follows a police killing in darkness and confusion invokes famous images of similar protests that have haunted the United States since the early 20th century. At the center of the melee is a working class couple who are pushed to the edge when their beloved son's future takes a grim turn. Petry has said that she was inspired by the events she witnessed while living in Harlem in 1943. Like a Winding Sheet briefly explores how the complications of racism haunt many Black women via partners who come home weary from the ways of the white world to take out their frustrations on dutiful wives and girlfriends. A cruel beating is the denouement to the protagonist's humiliating day at work as he strikes out at the very person who allows him to rest his weary head on her shoulders. However, it should be noted that racial strife is not the center of every tale in this. Petry's sole volume of short stories. Originally published as separate stories between 1945 and 1971, it is likely only the second volume of short stories ever to be published by an African American woman. The lengthy saga from which the book takes its name is narrated by a 12-year-old protagonist who, as the author did in her own youth, works in her family's pharmacy. Her observations about a single strong-willed aunt who has a career and her choice of underwhelming suitors are a subtle nod to a feminist worldview that has been both cited and dismissed by critics of the author's best-known work. Petry, of course, would quickly rise to international fame when her 1946 novel, The Street, with more than 1 million copies sold and translated into no less than 4 languages, outperformed any previous work of fiction by a Black woman writer. Unlike some of her more flamboyant peers, Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes among them, she was disinterested in the attention that accompanied her success and lived a very private life. Miss Muriel adds more tenor to questions that truly have haunted the fans of her novels. Had she not been divorced from the spotlight, might there have been more work in her catalog? Would there have been decades separating the original 1971 publication and this volume, its 1999 reissue, and the book you hold in your hands? Black women's voices matter, yet they are often silenced, ignored, or relegated to the margins of popular discourse. And as the results of the recently concluded 2016 US presidential election remind us, Black women are, more often than not, a moral compass that should be trusted or at the very least viewed as worthy of our attention. Some, ecate, some, e- some 8 decades after Ann Petry penned the first words that would make their way into Miss Muriel, let us give her the audience she deserves. Thus endeth the introduction. And so this is that story, Miss Muriel. Pardon me just a sec. Let's begin. Almost every day, Ruth Davis and I walk home from school together. We walk very slowly because we like to talk to each other and we don't get much chance in school or after school either. We are very much alike. We are both 12 years old and we are freshmen in high school and we never study. Well, not very much, because we learn faster than the rest of the class. We laugh about the same things and we are curious about the same things. We even wear our hair in the same style, thick braids halfway down our backs. We are not alike in one respect. She is white and I am black. Yesterday, when we reached the building that houses my father's drugstore, we sat down on the front steps, long steps that go all the way across the front of the building. Ruth said, "I wished I lived there," and patted the steps, though they are very splintery. Aunt Sophrina must have heard our voices because she came to the door and said, "I left my shoes at the shoemaker's this morning. Please go get them for me," and handed me a little cardboard ticket with a number on it. "You want me to come with, Ruth?" "I've got to go home. I'm sure my aunt will have things for me to do, just like your aunt." She smiled at Aunt Sophrina. I walked partway home with Ruth and turned back and went up Petticoat Lane toward the shoemaker shop. Mr. Beamish, the shoemaker, is a little white man with gray hair. He has a glass eye. This eye is not the same color as his own eye. It is a deeper gray. If I stand too close to him, I get a squeamish feeling because one eye moves in its socket and the other does not. Mr. Beamish and I are friends. I'm always taking shoes to his shop to be repaired. We do not own a horse and buggy, and so we walk a great deal. In fact, there is a family rule that we must walk any distance under 3 miles. As a result, our shoes are in constant need of repair. The soles and heels have to be replaced, and we always seem to be in need of shoelaces. Quite often, I snag the uppers on bull briars in the woods, and then the tears have to be stitched. When I get to Aunt Sophrina's shoes, Mr. Beamish was sitting near the window. It is a big window, and he has a very nice view of the street. He had on his leather apron and his eyeglasses. His glasses are very small, and they have steel rims. He was sewing a shoe, and he had a long length of waxed linen thread in his needle. He waxes the thread himself. I handed him the ticket, and he got up from his workbench to get the shoes. I saw that he had separated them from the other shoes. These are Aunt Sophrina's store shoes. They had been polished so they shone like patent leather. They lay alone near the front of the table where he keeps the shoes he has repaired. He leaned toward me, and I moved away from him. I did not like being so close to his glass eye. "The lady who brought these shoes in, who is she?" I looked at him and raised one eyebrow. It has taken me 2 months of constant practice in front of a mirror to master the art of lifting one eyebrow. Mr. Beamish said, "What's the matter with you? Didn't you hear what I said? Who was the lady who brought these shoes in?" I moved further away from him. He didn't know it, but I was imitating Dottle Smith, my favorite person in all the world. Dottle tells the most wonderful tales, and he can act and recite poetry. He visits our family every summer. Anyway, I bowed to Mr. Beamish, and I bowed to an imaginary group of people seated somewhere on my right, and I said, "Gentlemen, be seated. Mr. Bones, who was that lady I saw you with last night?" I lowered the pitch of my voice and said, "That wasn't no lady. That was my wife. Girlie." "Why do you keep calling me Girlie? I have a name." "I cannot remember people's names. I'm too old. I've told you that before." "How old are you, Mr. Beamish?" "None of your business." he said pettishly. Who? Well, I only ask in order to decide whether to agree with you that you're old enough to be forgetful. Does the past seem more real to you than the present? Mr. Beamish scowled his annoyance. The town is full of children, he said. It's the children who bring the shoes in and come to get them after I fix them. They run the errands. All those children look just alike to me. I can't remember their names. I don't even try. I don't plan to clutter up my mind with a lot of children's names. I don't see the same children that often, so I call the boys boy. I call the girls girly. I've told you this before. What's the matter with you today? It's spring and the church green is filled with robins looking for worms. Don't you sometimes wish you were a robin looking for a worm? He sighed. Now tell me, who was that lady that brought these shoes in? My Aunt Sophrina. Sophronia, he said. What a funny name. And she's your aunt? Yes. Does she live with you? Mr. Beamish's cat mewed at the door and I let her in. She is a very handsome creature, gray with white feet and really lovely fur. Mailing, mailing, I said, patting her. Where have you been? I always have the feeling that if I wait, if I persist, she will answer me. She is a very intelligent cat and very responsive. Does your aunt live with you? Yes. Has she been living with you very long? About 6 months, I guess. She's a druggist. You mean she knows about medicine? Just like my father, yes, they run the store together. Mr. Beamish thrust his hands in Aunt Sophronia's shoes and held them up, studying them. Then he made the shoes walk against the edge of the table in a mincing kind of walk, a caricature of the way a woman walks. She has small feet, hasn't she? No. I tried to sound like my mother when she disapproves of something. He flushed and wrapped the shoes in newspaper, making a very neat bundle. Is she married? Who? Aunt Sophrona? Aunt Sophronia? No, she's not married. Mr. Beamish took his cookie crock off the shelf. He lives in the shop. Against one wall, he has the kitchen stove, a big black iron stove with nickel fenders and a tea kettle on it, and there is a black iron sink with a pump right near the stove. He cooks his meals himself. He bakes bread, and usually there is a stew bubbling in a pot on the stove. In winter, the windows of his little shop frost over so that I cannot see in and he cannot see out. He draws his red curtains just after dusk and lights his lamps, and the windows look pink because of the frost and the red curtains and the light shining from behind them. Sometimes he forgets to draw the curtains that separate his sleeping quarters from the rest of the shop, and I can see his bed. It is a brass bed. He evidently polishes it because it shines like gold. It has a very intricate design on the headboard and the footboard. He has a little piece of flowered carpet in front of his bed. I can see his white china pot under the bed. A dark suit and some shirts hang on hooks on the wall. There is a chest of drawers with a small mirror and a gold frame over it, and a wash bowl and a pitcher on a nightstand. The wash bowl and pitcher are white with pink rosebuds painted on them. Mr. Beamish offered me a cookie from the big stoneware crock. Have a cookie, girlie. He makes big, thick molasses cookies. I ate 3 of them without stopping. I was hungry and did not know it. I ate the 4th cookie very slowly, and I talked to Mr. Beamish as I ate it. I don't think my Aunt Sophronia will ever get married. Why not? Well, I never heard of a lady druggist before, and I don't know who a lady druggist would marry. Would she marry another druggist? There aren't any around here anywhere except my father, and she certainly couldn't marry him. He's already married to my mother. She looks like a gypsy, Mr. Beamish said dreamily. You mean my Aunt Sophronia? Mr. Beamish nodded. She does not. She looks like my mother and my Aunt Ellen, and my father and my Uncle Jono say they look like Egyptian queens. They are not very tall, and they move quickly, and their skins are brown and very smooth, and their eyes are big and black, and they stand up very straight. They are not alike, though. My mother is business-minded. She likes to buy and sell things. She is a chiropodist and a hairdresser. Life sometimes seems full of other people's hair and their toenails. She makes her hair tonic and sells it to her customers. She designs luncheon sets and banquet cloths and guest towels and sells them. Aunt Ellen and Uncle Jono provide culture. Aunt Ellen lectures at schools and colleges. She plays Bach and Beethoven on the piano and organ. She writes articles for newspapers and magazines. I did not know very much about Aunt Sophronia. She works in the store. She fills prescriptions. She does embroidery. She reads a lot. She doesn't play the piano. She's very neat. The men who come in the store look at her out of the corner of their eyes. Even though she wears her hair skinned tight back from her forehead, she wears very plain clothes, dresses with long tight sleeves and high necks, but still looks like, well, like an Egyptian queen. She is young, but she seems very quiet and sober. Mr. Beamish offered me another cookie. I'll eat it on the way home to keep my strength up, thank you very much, I said primly. When I gave the shoes to Aunt Sophronia, I said, Mr. Beamish thinks you look like a gypsy. My mother frowned. Did he tell you to repeat that? No, he didn't, but I thought it was an interesting statement. I wish you wouldn't repeat the things you hear. It just causes trouble. Now every time I look at Mr. Beamish, I'll wonder about him. What will you wonder? I mean, she said I must go and practice my music lesson and ignored my question. I wonder how old I will be before I can ask questions of an adult and receive honest answers. My family always finds something for me to do. Are they not using their power as adults to give orders in order to evade ask the questions? That evening, about 5 o'clock, Mr. Beamish came in the store. I was sitting on the bench in the front. It is a very old bench. The customers sit there while they wait for their prescriptions to be filled. The wood is a beautiful color. It has a deep reddish brown. Mr. Beamish sat down beside me on the bench. His presence irritated me. He kept moving his hand up and down the arms of the bench, up and down in a quick, nervous movement. It is as though he thought he had an awl in his hand, and he was going in and out, making holes in leather and then sewing, slipping a needle in and out as he would mend a saddle or a pair of boots. My father looked at him over the top of his glass and said, Well, Beamish, what can I do for you? Nothing. Nothing at all. I just stopped in to pass the time of day to see how you all were. His voice trailed away softly. He comes every evening. I find this very annoying. Quite often I have to squeeze myself onto the bench. Pritchett, the sexton of the Congregational Church, stout, red-faced, smelling of whiskey, rings the bell for a service at 7 o'clock, and then he, too, sits in front of the store, watching the customers as they come and go until closing time. He eyed Mr. Beamish rather doubtfully at first, but then ignored him. When the sexton and Mr. Beamish were on the bench, there was just room enough for me to squeeze in between them. I didn't especially mind the sexton because he usually went to sleep, nodding and dozing until it was time to close the store. But Mr. Beamish doesn't sit still, and the movement of his hands is distracting. My mother finally spoke to my father about Mr. Beamish. They were standing in the back room. Why does Mr. Beamish sit out there in the store so much? She asked. Nothing else to do. She shook her head. I think he's interested in Sophronia. He keeps looking around for someone. My father laughed out loud. That dried up old white man? The laughter of my father is a wonderful sound. If you know anything about music, you know he sings tenor, and you know he sings in the Italian fashion with an open throat, and you begin to smile, and if he laughs long enough, you laugh too because you can't help it. Beamish, he said, and he laughed so hard that he had to lean against the door jamb in order to keep his balance. Every night, right after supper, Mr. Beamish sits in the store rubbing the arm of the bench with that quick jerking motion of his hand, nodding to people who come in, sometimes talking to them, but mostly just sitting. 2 weeks later, I walked past his shop. He came to the door and called me. Girlie, he said, beckoning. Yes, Mr. Beamish? Is your aunt with the peculiar name still here? That is, in town, living with you? Yes, she is, Mr. Beamish. Is don't she ever go into the drugstore? Not after 5 o'clock, Mr. Beamish. My father doesn't approve of ladies working at night. At night, we just act like other people's families. We sit around the table in the dining room and talk, and we play checkers, and we read, and we. Yes, he said impatiently. But don't your aunt ever go anywhere at night? I don't think so. I go to bed early. Do you think? And he shook his head. Never mind, girlie, never mind. And he sighed. Here, I just made up a fresh batch of these big cookies you like so well. I walked down Petticoat Lane toward the drugstore eating one of Mr. Beamish's thick molasses cookies. I wish I had taken time to tell him how cozy our downstairs parlor is in the winter. We have turkey red curtains at the windows too, and we pull the window shades and draw the curtains, and there's a very thick rug on the floor, and it is a small room, so the rug completely covers the floor. The piano is there, and an old fashioned sofa with a carved mahogany frame, and a very handsome round stove, and it is warm in the winter. And in the summer, when the windows are open, you can look right out into the backyard and smell the flowers and feel the cool air that comes from the garden. The next afternoon, Mr. Beamish came in the drugstore about 3:15. It was a cold, windy afternoon. I had just come from school, and there was a big mug of hot cocoa for me. Aunt Sophronia had it ready and waiting for me in the back room. I had just tasted the first spoonful. It was much too hot to gulp down, and I leaned way over and blew on it gently and inhaled the rich, chocolatey smell of it. I heard my aunt say, "Why, Mr. Beamish, what are you doing out at this hour?" "I thought I'd like an ice cream soda." Mr. Beamish's voice sounded breathless, lighter in weight, and the pitch was lower than normal. I peeked out at him. He was sitting near the fountain in one of the ice cream parlor chairs. He looked very stiff and prim and neater than usual. He seemed to have flattened his hair closer to his skull. This made his head appear smaller. He was holding his head a little to one side. He looked like a bird, but I cannot decide which bird. Perhaps a chickadee. He drank the soda neatly and daintily. He kept looking at Aunt Sophronia. He comes every day now, in the middle of the afternoon. He should have been in his shop busily repairing shoes or making boots or making stews and cookies. Instead, he is in our store, and his light gray eye, the one good eye, travels busily over Aunt Sophronia. His ears seem to waggle when he hears her voice, and he is taken to giggling in a very silly fashion. He always arrives about the same time. Sometimes I sit in one of the ice cream parlor chairs and talk to him. He smells faintly of leather and of shoe polish and of wax and of dead flowers. It was quite a while before I could place that other smell, dead flowers. Each day he stays a little longer than he stayed the day before. I have noticed that my father narrows his eyes a little when he looks at Mr. Beamish. I heard him say to my mother, "I don't like it. I don't want to tell him not to come in here, but I don't like it. An old white man in here every afternoon looking at Sophronia and licking his chops, well, I just don't like it." Aunt Sophronia took a sudden interest in the garden. In the afternoon after school, I help her set out plants and sow seed. Our yard is filled with flowers in the summer, and we have a vegetable garden that in some ways is as beautiful as the flowers. It is so neat and precise looking. We keep chickens so that we can have fresh eggs, and we raise a pig and have him butchered in the fall. When the weather is bad and we cannot work in the garden, Aunt Sophronia and I clean house. I do not like to clean house, but I do like to sort out the contents of other people's bureau drawers. We started setting Aunt Sophronia's bureau in order. She showed me a picture of her graduating class from pharmacy college. She was the only girl in a class of boys. She was black and the boys were white. I did not say anything about this difference in color, and neither did she, but I did try to find out what it was like to be the only member of the female sex in a class filled with males. "Didn't you feel funny with all those boys?" "They were very nice boys." "Oh, I'm sure they were, but didn't you feel funny being the only girl with so many young men?" "No, I never let them get overly friendly, and we got along very well." I looked at the picture and then I looked at her and said, "You are beautiful." She put the picture back in her top drawer. She keeps her treasures in there. She has a collar made of real lace and a pair of very long white kid gloves and a necklace made of gold nuggets from Colorado that a friend of my mother's left to Aunt Sophronia in her will. The gloves and the collar smell like our garden in August when the flowers are in full bloom and the sun is shining on them. Sometimes I forget that Aunt Sophronia is an adult and that she belongs in the enemy camp, and I make the mistake of saying what I have been thinking. I leaned against the bureau and looked down into the drawer at the picture and said, "You know, this picture reminds me of the night last summer when there was a female moth, one of those huge night moths on the inside of the screen door, and all the male moths for miles came around and clung on the outside of the screen, making their wings flutter. And you know, they didn't make any sound, but it was kind of scary. Weren't you?" Aunt Sophronia closed the drawer with a hard push. "You get a broom and dustpan and begin to sweep the hall," she said. On Saturday morning, after I finished washing the breakfast dishes and scrubbing the kitchen floor, I paid a call on Mr. Beamish. He was cleaning his house too. He had taken down the red curtains that hung in the windows all winter, and the red curtains that hung in front of his bed, separating his sleeping quarters from the rest of his shop, and he was washing these curtains in a big tub at the side of his house. He was making a terrific splashing, and the soap suds were pale pink. He had his sleeves rolled up. His arms are very white and stringy looking. Too much red for summer, girlie. I've got to get out the green summer ones. He hung them on the line and poured the wash water out on the ground. It was pink. Your curtain ran, didn't they? I looked at the little pink puddle left on top of a stone. If you keep washing them, they'll be pink instead of red. His own eye, the real eye, moved away from me, and there was something secret and rather sly about his expression. He said, I haven't seen your aunt in the store lately. Where is she? She's been busy fixing the garden and cleaning the house. Everybody seems to be cleaning house. As soon as I get my green curtains put up, I'm going to ask your aunt to come have tea. Where would she have tea with you? In my shop. I shook my head. Aunt Sophronia does not drink tea in people's bedrooms, and you have only that one room for your shop, and there's a bed in it, and it would be just like I would like to have her look at some old jewelry that I have, and I thought she might have tea. Mr. Beamish, I said, do you like my Aunt Sophronia? Now, girlie, he said, and he tittered. well, well, now, do you think your aunt likes me? Not especially. Not any more than anybody else. I think you're too old for her, and besides, well, you're white, and I don't think she would be very much interested in an old white man, do you? He frowned and said, You go home. You're a very rude girl. You asked me what I thought, Mr. Beamish. I don't see why you get mad when I tell you what I think. You did ask me, Mr. Beamish. I followed him inside his shop. He settled himself near the window and started to work on a man's boot. It needed a new sole, and he cut the sole out of leather. I looked out the front window. There was always enough breeze to make his sign move back and forth. It makes a sighing noise. In the winter, if there's a wind, the sign seems to groan because it moves back and forth quickly. There is a high-laced shoe painted on the sign. The shoe must have once been a deep, dark red, but it is weathered to a soft rose color. Mr. Beamish is my friend, and I wanted to indicate that I'm still fond of him, though I disapprove of his interest in Aunt Sophronia. I searched for some topic that would indicate that I enjoy talking to him. I said, Why don't you have a picture of a man's boot on your sign? I prefer ladies' shoes. More delicate, more graceful. He made an airy gesture with his awl and simpered. I went home and I told Aunt Sophronia that Mr. Beamish is going to ask her to have tea with him. Will you go? Of course not, she said impatiently. Aunt Sophronia did not have tea with Mr. Beamish. He sees her so rarely in the store that he finally came in search of her. It is summer now, and the Wheeling Inn is open for the season. The great houses along the waterfront are occupied by their rich owners. We are all very busy. At night, after the store is closed, we sit in the backyard. On those warm June nights, the fireflies come out, and there is a kind of soft summer light composed of moonlight and starlight. The grass is thick underfoot, and the air is sweet. Almost every night, my mother and my father, and Aunt Sophronia and I, and sometimes Aunt Ellen and Uncle Jono, sit there in the quiet, in the sweetness, and in that curious soft light. Last night, when we were sitting there, Mr. Beamish came around the side of the house. There was something tentative in the way he came toward us. I had been lying on the grass, and I sat up straight, wondering what they would do and what they would say. He sidled across the lawn. He didn't speak until he was practically upon us. My mother was sitting in the hammock under the cherry tree, rocking gently back and forth, and she didn't see him until he spoke. He said, Good evening. He sounded as though he were asking a question. We all looked at him. I hoped that someone would say, What are you doing in our backyard, our private place, our especially private place? You are an intruder. Go back to your wax thread and your awl. Go back to your house and your cat. Nobody said anything. He stood there for a while, waiting, hesitant, and then he bowed and sat down cross-legged on the grass near Aunt Sophronia. He was sitting on one of the benches. She was sitting on one of the benches, and he sat so close to her that her skirt was resting on one of his trouser legs. I kept watching him. One of his hands reached toward her skirt, and he gently fingered the fabric. Either she felt this or the motion attracted her attention because she moved away from him and gathered her skirt about her, and then stood up and said, "The air is making me sleepy. Good night." The next afternoon, I took a pair of my father's shoes to Mr. Beamish to have the heels fixed. My father wears high-laced black shoes. I left them on Mr. Beamish's work table. "You can get them tomorrow." I did not look right at him. I leaned over and patted Mei. "She has such a lovely name, Mr. Beamish. It seems to me a name especially suited for a cat." Mr. Beamish looked at me over the top of his little steel-rimmed glasses. "You've got a nice backyard," he said. "I don't think you should have been in it." "Why not?" he asked sharply. "Did anybody say that I shouldn't have been in it?" "No, but the front part of the building, the part where the drugstore is, belongs to everybody. The back part of the building and the upstairs in the building and the yard are ours. The yard is a private part of our lives. You don't belong in it. You're not part of our family." "But I'd like to be part of your family." "You can't get to be a part of other people's families. You have to be born into a family. The family part of our lives is just for us. Besides, you don't seem to understand that you're the wrong color, Mr. Beamish." He didn't answer this. He got up and got his cookie crock and silently offered me a cookie. After I returned from the shoe shop, I sat on the wooden steps that run across from the drugstore. I was trying to decide how I really feel about Mr. Beamish. I always sit at the far end of the steps with my back against the tight board fence. It is a very good place from which to observe the street, the front of the store, the church green. People walk past me not noticing that I am there. Sometimes their conversations are very unusual. I can see a long way down the path that bisects the green. It is a dirt path and not too straight. The only straight paths in the town are those in front of the homes of people who have gardeners. From where I sat, I could see a young man approaching. From where I sat, I could see a man approaching. He was strolling the path that crosses the church green. This is a most unusual way for a man to walk in the Wheeling in the summer. It is during the summer that the year-round residents earn their living. They mow lawns and cut hedges and weed gardens and generally look after the summer people. Able-bodied men in Wheeling walked fast in the summer. This tall, broad-shouldered man was strolling down the path. He was wearing a white suit, the pants quite tight in the leg, and he had his hands in his hip pockets and a stiff straw hat, a boater, on the back of his head. I sat up very straight when I discovered that this was a very dark-colored man. I could not imagine where he came from. He could not possibly have been a butler or a waiter, even if he had wanted to, and spent a whole lifetime in trying. He would never have been able to walk properly. He would always swagger. And who ever heard of a swaggering butler or waiter who strolled around a table? As he came nearer, I saw that he had a beard, an untidy, shaggy beard like the beard of a goat. His hair was long and shaggy and rough-looking too. Though he was tall with wide shoulders, the thick, rough hair on his head and the goat's beard made his head and face look too big, out of proportion to his body. When he saw me, he came straight toward me. He bent over me smiling, and I moved back away from him, pressing against the fence. His eyes alarmed me. Whenever I think about his eyes, I close mine, trying to shut his out. They are reddish brown and they look hot, and having looked into them, I cannot seem to look away. I have never seen anyone with eyes that color or with that strange quality, whatever it is. I described them as looking hot, but that's not possible. It must be that they are the color of something that I associate with fire or heat. I do not know what it is. "You lost?" he said. "No, are you?" "Yep, all us black folks is lost." He said this in a husky, unmusical voice and turned away and went into the store. I went into the store too. If this unusual looking man with the goat's beard got into a discussion of all us black folks is lost with my father, I wanted to hear it. My father said, "Howdy do," and he made it into a question. The bearded man nodded and said, "The druggist in?" "I'm the druggist." "This your store?" "That's right." "Nice place you got here. You been here long?" My father grunted. I waited for him to make the next move in the game we called Stanley and Livingstone. All black strangers who came into our store were Livingstones, and it was up to the members of our family to find out which lost Mr. Livingstone or which lost Mrs. Livingstone we had encountered in the wilds of the all white town of Wheeling. When you live in a town where there aren't any other black people, naturally, you're curious when another black person shows up. I sat down in front of the store and waited for my father to find out which Mr. David Livingstone he was talking to and what he was doing in our town. But my father looked at him with no expression on his face and said, "And what did you want?" The man with the goat's beard fished in the pocket of his tight white pants. In order to do this, he thrust his leg forward a little to ease the strain on the fabric, and thus he gave the impression that he was pawing the ground. He handed my father a piece of paper. "I got a prescription for a lotion." "It'll take a few minutes," my father said, and went into the back room. The bearded man came and sat beside me. "Do you live here in Wheeling?" I asked. "I work at the inn. I'm the piano player." "You play the piano?" "And sing. I'm the whole orchestra. I pay for the dinner hour. I play for all those nice rich white folk to dance at night. I'll be here all summer." "You will?" "That's right. And I've never seen a deader town." "What's your name?" "Chink." "Mr. Chink?" "No," he said and stood up. "Chink is my first name, Chink Johnson." Mr. Johnson is a restless kind of man. He keeps moving around even when he's sitting still, moving his feet, his hands, his head. He crosses his legs, uncrosses them, claps his hands together, unclasps them. "Why are you having a prescription filled?" "Hand lotion. I use it for my hands." My father came out of the back room, wrapped up a bottle, and said, "Here you are." Chink Johnson paid him and said goodbye to me, and I said, "Goodbye, Chink." "What's his name?" "Chink Johnson. He plays the piano at the end." Chink Johnson seems to me a very interesting and unusual man. To my surprise, my father did not mention our newest Mr. Livingstone to the family. He said nothing about him at all. Neither did I. Yet, he comes in the drugstore fairly often. He buys cigarettes and throat lozenges. Sometimes he drives over from the inn in a borrowed horse and carriage. Sometimes he walks over. My father has very little to say to him. He doesn't linger in the store because my father's manner is designed to discourage him from lingering or hanging around. But he does seem to be looking for something. He looks past the door of the prescription room, and on hot afternoons, the door in the very back is open, and you can see our yard with its beautiful little flower gardens. And he looks out into the yard, seems to search it. When he leaves, he looks at the house, examining it. It's as though he's trying to see around a corner, see through the walls, because some sixth sense has told him that there exists on the premises something that will interest him. If he looks hard enough, he will find it. My mother finally caught a glimpse of him as he went out the front door. She saw what I saw. Hang on a second, I lost my place. She saw what I saw. The goat's beard in silhouette, the forward thrust of his head, the thick, shaggy hair. Because we were standing in the prescription room looking toward the door. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "That's the piano player at the inn." "That's the piano player at the inn," my father said. "You've never mentioned him. What's his name?" "Jones," my father said. I started to correct him, but I was afraid to interrupt him because he started talking fast in a very loud voice. "Lightfoot Jones," he said. "Shake Jones. Barrel House Jones." He started tapping on the glass case in front of him. I have never heard him do this before. He sings in the Congregational Church Choir. He has a pure lyric tenor voice, and he sings all the tenor solos. The Sanctus, the Heavens Are Telling. You can tell from his speaking voice that he sings. He is always humming or singing or whistling. There he was with the pencil in his hand, tapping out a most peculiar rhythm on the glass of the showcase. "Shake Jones," he repeated. "Rhythm in his feet, rhythm in his blood, rhythm in his feet, rhythm in his blood. Beats out his life, beats out his lungs, beats out his liver on the piano." And he began a different and louder rhythm with his foot. "On a piano, on a piano, on a piano." "Samuel, what's the matter with you? What are you talking about?" I'm talking about Tremblin' Shakefoot Jones, the piano player who can't sit still and sits in here looking around, prancing and stamping his hoofs and sniffing the air, just like a stallion who smells a mare, a stallion who, Samuel, how can you talk that way in front of this child? My father was silent. I said, his name is Chink Johnson. My father roared, terrible in his anger. His name is Duke. His name is Bubber. His name is Count, is Maharaja, is King of Lions. I don't give a good goddamn what he calls himself. I don't want him and his restless feet hanging around. He can let his long feet slap anybody else's floor, but not mine. Not here. He glared at me and glared at my mother. His fury silenced us. At that moment, his eyes were red-brown, just like Chink Jones, Noel Johnson. He is shorter, he has no beard, but he had at that moment a strong resemblance to Chink. I added to his fury. I said, you look just like Chink Johnson. He said, ah! He was so angry I could not understand one word he said. I went out the front door and across the street and sat on the church steps and watched the world go by and listened to the faint hum it made as it went around and around. I saw Mr. Beamish go into the drugstore. He stayed a long time. That gave me a certain pleasure because I knew he had come to eat his ice cream soda mouthful by mouthful from one of our long-handled ice cream soda spoons and to look at Aunt Sophronia as he nibbled at the ice cream. He always looks at her out of the corner of his eyes, stealing sly little glances at her. I knew that Aunt Sophronia would not be in the store until much later and that he was wasting his time. It was my father's birthday, and Aunt Sophronia was in the kitchen baking a great big cake for him. If Mr. Beamish had known this, he might have dropped in on the birthday celebration, even though he hadn't been invited. After all, he had sidled into our backyard without being invited, and our yard is completely enclosed by a tight board fence, and there is a gate that you have to open to get in the yard, so that entering our yard is like walking into our living room. It is a very private place. Mr. Beamish is the only person that I know of who has come into our yard without being invited. And he keeps coming too. After Mr. Beamish left the store, I crossed the street and sat outside the store steps. It was hot. It was very quiet. Old Lady Chimble crossed the church green carrying a black silk umbrella and opened it and used it as a sunshade. A boy went by on a bicycle. Frances Jackins. We called her Aunt Frank. The black cook in the boarding house across the street arrived carrying something in a basket. She is always cross and usually drunk. She drinks gin. Mother says it is what has made Aunt Frank's lips look as though they were turned inside out. She said this is called a gin lip. They are bright red and almost like a red gash across the dark skin of her face. I want very much to ask Aunt Frank about this, how it feels, when it happened, etc. And someday I will, but I have not as yet had a suitable opportunity. When she is drunk, she cannot give a sensible answer to a sensible question, and when she is sober, or partially sober, she is very irritable and constantly finds fault with me. She is absolutely no relation to us. It is just that my mother got in the habit of calling her Aunt Frank so many years ago, and so we all call her that. Because I am young, she tries to boss me and to order me around, and she calls me Miss in a very unpleasant, sarcastic way. She is a very good cook when she is sober, but when she is drunk, she burns everything, and she is always staggering across the street and stumbling up our back steps with bread pans filled with dough which would not rise because she had forgotten the yeast, and with burned cakes and pies and burned hams and roasts of beef. When she burns things, they are not just scorched, they are blackened and hardened until they are like charcoal. Almost every night she scratches our back door. I have sharper hearing than everybody else. I can hear people walking around the side of the house when no one else has heard them. Anyway, I always hear her first. I open the door suddenly and very fast, and she almost falls into the kitchen and stands there swaying and fouling our kitchen with the sweetish smell of gin and the dank, musty odor of her clothes. She always has a dip of snuff under her upper lip, and she talks around this obstruction so that her voice is peculiar. She speaks quickly to keep the snuff in place, and sometimes she pauses and works her upper lip, obviously getting the snuff in some special spot. When she comes to the back door at night, she puts the basket of ruined food just inside the door, on the floor, and says to my mother, "Here, Martha, throw this away. Throw it away for me. Give it to the hen. Feed it to the pig." She turns all two-syllable words into separate one-syllable words. She doesn't say Martha all in one piece. She separates it so that it becomes Martha She doesn't say away, but away is a very jerky kind of speech. I am always given the job of burying the stuff in the backyard, way down in the back. I dig a hole and throw the blackened mess in it and cover it with lime to hasten decomposition and discourage skunks and dogs. Sometimes I hide behind the fence and yell at her on her way back across the street. Old Aunt Frankie, black as tar, trying to get to heaven in electric car. Car got stalled in the underpass. Threw Aunt Frankie right on her ass. Whenever I sing-song this rhyme at her, she invariably tries to climb over the fence, a furious, drunken old woman threatening me with a man's umbrella that she carries. I should think that she would remember from past performances that she cannot possibly reach me, but she always tries. After several futile efforts, she gives up and goes back to the boarding house across the street. A lot of old maids and widows live there. No gentlemen, just ladies. They spend their spare time rocking on the front porch and playing whist and looking over to the drugstore. Aunt Frank spends her spare time in the kitchen of the boarding house, rocking and emptying bottle after bottle of gin. But on the day of my father's birthday, she was sober. At least, she walked as though she were. She had a basket on her arm with a white napkin covering its contents. I decided she must have made something special for my father's supper. She went in the drugstore, and when she came out, she didn't have the basket. She saw me sitting on the steps, but she ignored me. Aunt Sophronia came and stood in the window. She had washed the glass globes that we keep filled with blue, red, and yellow liquid. She was wearing a dark skirt and a white blouse. Her hair was no longer skin tight from back from her forehead. It was curling around her forehead, perhaps because she had been working in the garden, bending over, and the hairpins that usually hold it so tightly in place had worked themselves loose. She didn't look real. The sun was shining in the window and it reflected the lights from the jars of colored water back on her face and her figure, and she looked golden and rose-colored and lavender. It was as though there were a rainbow moving in the window. Chink Johnson drove up in his borrowed horse and carriage. He stood and talked to me and then started to go in the store, saw Aunt Sophronia, and stood still. He took a deep breath. I could hear him. He took the stiff straw hat that he wore way back on his head and bowed to her. She nodded as though she didn't really want to, and turned away and acted as though she were very busy. He grabbed my arm and actually pinched it. "What are you doing?" I said angrily. "What is the matter with you? Let go my arm." "Shut up," he said impatiently, pinching harder. His fingers felt as though they were made of iron. "Who is that?" I pried his fingers loose and rubbed my arm. "Where?" "In the window." "Who is that girl in the window?" "That's my Aunt Sophronia." "Your aunt? Your aunt?" "Yes." He went into the store. One moment he was standing beside me, and the next moment he had practically leaped inside the store. I went in too. He was leaning in the window saying, "Wouldn't you like to go for a walk with me this Sunday?" She shook her head. "Well, couldn't you go for a ride with me?" "I'll call for you." Aunt Sophronia said, "I work every day." "Every day?" he said. "But that's not possible. Nobody works every day. I'll be back tomorrow." And he was gone. Aunt Sophronia looked startled. She didn't look angry, just sort of surprised. I said, "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow." And I thought, well, she's got two suitors now. There's this Shake Jones Livingstone, otherwise known as Chink Johnson, and there's Mr. Beamish. I do not think I would pick either one. Mr. Beamish is too old, even though he is my friend. I think of Chink Johnson as my friend too, but I do not think he would make a good husband. I tried to decide why I do not approve of him as a husband for Aunt Sophronia. I think it's because Aunt Sophronia is a lady and Chink Johnson is, well, he is not a gentleman. That night at supper, we celebrated my father's birthday. At that hour, nobody much came in the store. Pickett, the sexton, sat on the bench in front, and if anybody came in and wanted my father, he'd come to the back door and holler for him. There was a white tablecloth on the big oak dining room table, and we used my mother's best Haviland china and the sterling silver knives and forks with the rose pattern. And there was a pile of packages by my mother's plate, and there were candles on the cake, and we had ice cream for dessert. My old enemy, Aunt Frank, had delivered Parker House rolls for his birthday and had made him a milk pan full of rice pudding. Because my father had always said that when he dies, he hopes it will be because he drowns in a sea composed of rice pudding, that he could eat rice pudding morning, noon, and night. Aunt Frank must have been sober when she made the pudding, for it was creamy and delicious, and I ate two helpings of it right along with my ice cream. I kept waiting for Aunt Sophronia to say something about Chink Johnson. He is a very unusual looking man, and we've never had a customer, black or white, with that kind of beard. She did not mention him. Neither did I. My father has never mentioned him, at least not at the table. I wonder if my father hopes he will vanish. Perhaps they were afraid that he will become a part of the family circle if they mention him. Now, Chink Johnson has become a part of the family circle, and he used the same method that Mr. Beamish used. He just walked into the yard and into the house. I was upstairs and I happened to look out the window, and there was Chink Johnson walking up the street. He opened our gate, walked around the side of the house and into our backyard. I hurried to the back of the house and looked out the window and saw him open the screen and go into the kitchen door. I hurried to the back of the house and looked out the window and saw him open up the screen door and go into the kitchen. He didn't knock on the door either. He just walked in. For the longest time, I didn't hear a sound. I listened and listened. I must have stood still for 15 minutes. Then I heard someone playing our piano. I knew it must be Chink Johnson because this was not the kind of music anyone in our house would have been playing. I ran downstairs. My mother had been in the cellar, and she came running up out of the cellar, and my father came hurrying over from the drugstore. We all stood and looked and looked. Chink was sitting at our piano. He had a cigarette dangling from his lower lip, and the smoke from the cigarette was a cloud, a blue-gray hazy kind of cloud around his face, his eyes, his beard, so that you could only catch glimpses of them through the smoke. He was playing some kind of fast, discordant sounding music, and he was slapping the floor with one of his long feet, and he was slapping the keys with his long fingers. Aunt Sophronia was leaning against the piano, looking down at him. He did not use music when he played, and he never once looked at the keyboard. He just kept looking right into Aunt Sophronia's eyes. I thought my father would tell Chink to go slap somebody else's floor with his long feet, but my mother gave him one of those "now don't say a word" looks, and he glared at Chink and went back to the drugstore. Chink stayed a long time. He played the piano, he sang, or rather, I guess you could say he talked to the music. It was a very peculiar kind of musical performance. He plays some chords, a whole series of them, and he makes peculiar changes in the chords as he plays, and then he says the words of a song. He doesn't really sing, but his voice does change in pitch to, in a sense, match the chords he is playing. And he does talk to a kind of rhythm which also matches the chords. I sat down beside him and watched what he was doing, and listened to the words he said, and though it is not exactly music as I am accustomed to hearing it, I found it very interesting. He told me that what he does with those songs is known as the talkin' blues, only he said talkin', and he made blues sound like it was two separate words, not just a two-syllable word, but two distinct words. I've been trying to play the piano the way he does, but I get nothing but terrible sounds. I pretend that I am blind and keep my eyes closed all the time while I feel for chords. He must have a special gift for this because it is an extremely difficult thing that he is doing, and I don't know whether I will ever be able to do it. He has a much better ear for music than I have. Chink Johnson comes to see Aunt Sophronia almost every day. Sometimes when I look out in the backyard, Mr. Beamish is out there too. He always sits on the ground, and at his age, I should think it might give him rheumatism. He must be a very brave little man, or else his love for Aunt Sophronia has given him great courage. I say this because Chink Johnson is very rude to Mr. Beamish, and he stares at him with a dreadfully cruel look on his face. If I were small and slender and old like Mr. Beamish, I would not sit in the same yard with a much bigger, much younger man who obviously did not want me there. I have thought a great deal about Mr. Beamish. I like him. He is truly a friend, but I do not think he should be interested in Aunt Sophronia, at least not in a loving kind of way. The thing that bothers me is that I honestly can't decide whether I object to him as a suitor for her because he is white or because he is old. Sometimes I think it is for both reasons. I am fairly certain it isn't just because he's old. This bothers me. If my objections to him are because he's white, and that's what I told him, but I often say things I know people don't want to hear, and they particularly don't want to hear from someone very much younger than they are, then I have been trained on the subject of race, just as I have been trained to be a Christian. I know how I was trained to be a Christian, Sunday school, prayers, etc. I do not know exactly how I've been trained on the subject of race. Then why do I feel like this about Mr. Beamish? And thus endeth part one. So this was part one of Miss Muriel, the titular story and the first story from the collection by Ann Petry called Miss Muriel and Other Stories. And I personally enjoyed reading it a lot. I enjoyed reading it a lot, a lot. In Tuesday's show, we read another story from Tony Cade Bombara, as well as a story from Edwidge Danticat. And in both stories, we talked about these plucky, spunky young girls and how these women have crafted these amazingly powerful young girls who have no qualms about getting in the face of adults and telling them what's what. In the story Happy Birthday, we met a young girl who stood up to the angry preacher and told him exactly what he could do with his particular concerns about what her behavior was on the day that she felt that she had been slighted. And of course, that reminded those of us who were present for the earlier reading by Tony Cade Bombara of Gorilla My Love. It reminded us of the young girl in that story, whose name I always forget, but I know that Angel always remembers it, so I'm going to wait to read to it. This is another story where we have this incredible, very in your face black girl. And I think what was, for me, most entertaining and most eye opening, like I was trying to keep it together as I was reading, was she told this white man straight up to his face, "This is our space and you don't belong here." And it's not a popular opinion, but the need to protect and to keep Black spaces, particularly when we have been plucked up and ripped out of our original space. When every time we create a space for ourselves, if it gets too big and it gets too popular and it gets to be too successful, we can count on, like clockwork, the orchestration of white hegemony to come and try and dismantle or otherwise decimate and destroy it. And I cannot imagine what it's like for this successful Black family in this all white enclave to have this tiny little piece of peace that is theirs, and have this kindly, well meaning man stride up in it like he belongs. It's the familiarity, it's the audacity of that familiarity that I can imagine galls this young girl to the point that she speaks to him in a way that I think for most of us, with our training and with our understanding of this time period, we would have this expectation that what she was saying was tremendously dangerous. How is a 12-year-old girl going to tell an elderly white man, elderly in this time period, which is prior to the 1940s? So if he's old in the 1940s, then that means that he came up in the early 1900s, which means that slavery was just a whisper of gone when he was a boy. So his understanding of Black and white relations has got to be informed heavily by that and influenced heavily by that. And here's this girly, as he calls her, telling him where he does and does not belong. What an explosive moment, right? Let me go back and try and capture some of your comments. Let's see. I see Latricia Ransom made it in, and hello, good to see you. I see Erica Yolita made it in. She was a little bit late, and she ran the track back. And Homie Lou, I see, made it. She is still with her. I am my aunt's nephew, Carter. Okay, so I'm guessing that we have Homie Lou and we have Carter with us. So hi, Carter. Good to have you here. I'm not sure how much of the story you heard, but I'm glad to see you. So Mimi Brown, speaking of, I can only imagine, Mr. Beamish said, he nosy. Yeah, he is. And as Lisa Bobbitt pointed out accurately, he is super interested. Um, and then she corrected herself, and I think this is probably more appropriate. The man thirsty. The man's mad thirsty and is in fact doing the most. But when she when he said, "Does your aunt like me?" Not especially. I was tickled I was tickled. L Jack gets right to the point. No cream in her aunt's coffee. Like these black folk don't seem to be having it. They are not here for the fuck shit. Um Angel Monique saying she loves this baby. She doesn't hold anything back. And I think that's what makes this story so interesting. I really cannot wait to get to part two on Tuesday so that we can find out what's what. But yeah, Beamish, for all of his, presumed well intentions, we can presume that his intentions are good. He gonna learn today. He gonna learn today. He don't want this honesty. Like this child who is clearly very well educated and feels comfortable in her space in the world. And I mean, what a beautiful thing for a young black girl at that age and that time to feel comfortable in her space in the world. Uh yeah, yeah. So let's talk about some of these descriptions. Now, Lisa Bobbitt responding to Jack says that she must really be something, and we're talking about Sophronia. Now, some of the descriptions we hear, we hear about her looking like an Egyptian queen, which I think by itself says a lot, right? So again, considering the time period and the images that we have of, probably the most famous Egyptian queen being Cleopatra, this sense of regalness, a long, slender neck, these sort of aquiline features, this beautiful bronze skin, these bright, large cat-like eyes, full lips, like this very golden. Stevie Wonder has a song "Golden Lady." I kind of get the sense that Sophronia occurs for people like that. The word statuesque comes to mind. So we have this amazing description of Sophronia, but let's talk about Chink Johnson because the way he's described here, this goat-like beard, which to me, I don't know if anybody else got this, but between the hot eyes and the goat-like beard, automatically took me to the devil. I was like, oh, Chink Johnson is Satan. Clearly, that's old Slewfoot. And the way that the father responded with the several names and the cadence that Miss Petry gives the father is almost ministerial, right? Like it's almost like a preacher, a pastor kind of working his way up. And you can imagine the way pastors talk about the devil having many names, the different sort of never calling him by his actual name, but calling him everything around the name. And even the way that Petry gives us this idea that they didn't want to say his name because it would almost be like summoning him into the family circle. And then lo and behold, as soon as he becomes a part of the conversation, he's a part of the family circle. Coming in without being invited, but having said his name, it's almost as though you invoked him. So I'm really, really curious to find out what this Chink Johnson character is about. But let's put the picture together. Tall, dark skin, red burnt sienna, glowing like eyes, long fingers, long feet, thin, slender, but still stuffed into a white suit, wearing a boater hat, a straw firm boater hat, but wearing it on the back of his head. And in a town where men of industry walk quickly back and forth to where he needs to go, this man strolls. She said that he could never be a butler because he wouldn't even be able to stop the swagger in his walk. He'd never be able to learn right. He'd never be able to learn how to walk right because he would swagger. It was just inevitable. I kind of get again, that kind of takes me back to this idea of him being somewhat Satan-like, because this strolling up and down, seeking whom he may devour, right? For those of you all who got, churched when you were kids or who are a little churchy right now, you're familiar with that language. You get what I'm saying? Like the comfort that he has just kind of roaming around the world, because what you gonna do? Um, I see that some of y'all are feeling it with me. I see that L Jack says me too. Judy Lee mentions the goat beard, right? The audacity of familiarity. So it's one thing to have it coming from Beamish. It's another thing to have it coming from Chink Johnson. But both of these folks are interlopers who are not welcome there. Not welcome there. Tolerated. Tolerated in a way that almost seems like these folks are held hostage, right? Like there's something there that's keeping this family from being able to push them away, and they certainly ought to be able to. Now, maybe with Beamish there is the cruelty of the time and the possibility of retribution, but what's keeping them from telling Chink Johnson to get the Falte property? Give me some of your thoughts. I'm sorry. I just saw this. Mimi Brown says the audacity of familiarity. Angel Monique comes back with it was the caucasity for me. The caucasity and the audacity of the familiarity. And so we've got two, right? We've got one operating out of caucasity and the other operating out of audacity, but neither one of them need to be in that space. And then, man, w- how open does your nose have to be that you will sit in the garden with Satan and compete with him for a woman that don't even want you? The devil looking at you side eye like, man, if you don't get the fuck up out of here, I'm gonna mess you up. You don't get on my face. And you just gonna sit there anyway? Like, I guess you must feel like the devil in you stronger than the devil itself. Like, that's gotta be what it is. Because what keeps you there? What makes you think you get to stay there? Mimi Brown hated Mr. Beamish calling her girly. I hated that too. There felt the familiarity with the young girl at the age of 12, even giving her the cookies. And clearly she likes the man, she likes the cookies. And I feel like she doesn't feel threatened by him because she feels comfortable in her space in the world. But I feel like there is a threat there. She may be choosing not to acknowledge it, but I feel like there's something very dangerous about this man. Like I keep waiting for, no pun intended, given his vocation, the other shoe to drop. Because it just seems like there's only so much rejection a white man can take. Right? I mean, come on. We all live in the same world that's been informed by the same activity. Shit. We've all seen the last 4 years of what happens when a white man can't stand the fact that people don't want him. Don't want his ass, but refuses to accept that. So there is, I think, an inherent danger that he might intend toward her. And I don't think she's ignorant of it. I think she just doesn't feel threatened. I think she feels that comfort. Mimi Brown says that there was something menacing in it. And yeah, I can't help but see it. We are close to time. I kind of want to keep going. Like I want to know about some of your thoughts about the descriptions, the garden, the way that she described the sanctuary of it, the way that she described the beauty of their home. Not only that, but the beauty of their home juxtaposed against the commonness, the basicness of Mr. Beamish's home, knowing good and damn well Mr. Beamish is white and they're black, but they seem to have the ends. They got the ends, the means, the resources. Mr. Beamish is eating stew off the pot of the stove that's in the same room where he sleeps, which is just adjacent to the same room where he works, separated only by a curtain. They have a shop, they have a parlor, they have a dining room, they have bedrooms upstairs, they have a large enough house to have a storefront in the front and a home in the back and a big backyard where they can relax. And you can't help but notice the class juxtaposition with the racial juxtaposition. Now, we closed this particular section with the author presenting a very significant and interesting question. She said, I know where I was trained on Christianity. I'm trying to figure out where I got trained on race. Because she has ideas about race, and they're very firm with her. She's not questioning whether they're right or wrong. She's just questioning where they came from. And I think that's interesting. It's fascinating to see. It will be fascinating to see what her answers are. I'm looking at the comments. Because I know some of the predilections and the tastes of some of the readers here, I'm curious what Terry Meredith has to say. I'm curious what Kamisha Umstead has to say. Some of you, I'm just kind of waiting for you to chime in because I know the kind of stuff that you read. Angel Monique being a significant fan of Zora Neale Hurston, looking at these two as peers, contemporaries of one another, one writing about this up north experience while the other writes often of this down south experience, but both of them trading in very rich, very deep descriptions. There's so much more I think that we can discuss. Those of us who are part of the after story are going to discuss some of that, and I think we're just going to have a much more open discussion on it. I'll have some specific questions for the rest of you all. Think about some of those thoughts. Throw them up in the comments, throw them into the inbox, send us an email. We're going to respond to it. We're going to keep talking about it. And let me know in this first outing, if you have heard of Ann Petry before, what did you think of this particular story? If you've never heard of Ann Petry before, let us know in the comments or follow us on any of our other social media platforms and let us know there what you thought of this first half of Miss Muriel by Ann Petry. Now, let's see. I want to make sure that if you are interested in it, you know where to get it. You can purchase your own copy of Miss Muriel and Other Stories at Underground Books at the link there. So if you're following us on Facebook, you can go ahead and look in the thread and find that link and click on it. For those of you who are joining us on Twitch or joining us on YouTube, you're going to have to write it down. I'll try and make sure that we put it in the YouTube comments so that you can find it there. But if you do like this story and you want to find out more, and maybe you just can't wait till Tuesday, go ahead and pick up yourself a copy, and support local bookstores, support Black bookstores. We're always going to find one that we support. It might not be in your area, but it's going to be independent. It's going to be Black, and you're going to be helping a Black business sell Black lit to Black people, because that is one of the biggest parts of the mission of Storytime with Julian, is to preserve our art and our literature, and to make sure that we give you all options to keep it going and keep it within this community. All right, all right. Now Terry Meredith said that she can't comment because she was okay, so she painted and done lost focus. When you re-listen, Terry Meredith, I would love. Listen, I know you don't do commissions. I ain't telling you what to paint, but I would love to hear, at least hear how the descriptions of Chink Johnson occur for you, and what you see, if you see anything, because it seemed really, really visual to me. And that was actually part of the reason that I was curious to know what your thoughts were. Please follow us on social media. You can find us at Storytime with Julian on Facebook, on Twitter and Instagram. It's just Storytime Julian. Same on Clubhouse. Storytime, it is here. We've got it wrong. It says Storytime with Julian, but it's actually just Storytime Julian on Clubhouse. On YouTube, it's youtube.com/Storytime with Julian. And if you want to talk just to me, you can check out my Twitter handle is Magnet for Awesome. Thank you so much, Judy Lee, for that. Thanks. I appreciate it. Latricia, make sure that you get a chance to re-listen to. And I'm actually glad that my voice helped you get a little bit of rest. This has been Storytime with Julian. I am, of course, Julian, and I can't wait to finish this story with you on Tuesday. In the meantime, y'all have a great weekend. Continue to support us. Let your friends know about us. If you enjoyed this, make sure you share this link. Make sure you just tell somebody, tell them in person, make a post about it, but let people know the Storytime with Julian is doing this thing, and help us grow, help us spread the word, and help us get more new words out there. All right, y'all. Thus endeth the story. We're going to go ahead and check it out, and I will see you next week. Peace.